My name is Claire, and I was 33 years old when my sister stood up at my mother's retirement party in front of 60 people and told the room that she was the one who had held our family together. I was sitting 4 tables away. I had driven 5 hours to be there. And I had been sending my sister $1,800 a month, every month for 8 years because she had called it a loan because I had believed her, and because I had been raised in a family where the word no had a very particular cost when directed at the people who were supposed to love you most. Her exact words, delivered with the confidence of someone who has never once examined her own accounting, were, "I've carried this family. Claire just tags along." I didn't stand up. I didn't argue. I picked at my water glass, I took a slow sip, and I thought about the folder sitting in my car. I had not come to my mother's retirement party looking for a confrontation, but I had come prepared for the truth to need a witness. And what happened when the accountant opened that folder, in that room, in front of those 60 people, is something I am still, quietly, grateful for. There is a particular kind of oldest daughter that certain families produce, and I was that kind. Not the dramatic one. Not the one who needed to be managed or soothed or talked down from something. The one who showed up early, stayed late, noticed what needed to be done before anyone else had registered that it needed doing, and did it without announcing herself. I had been that person since I was approximately 9 years old, when I realized that if I didn't pack my own lunch before school it simply would not get packed, and that this was not a crisis in my household. It was just the weather. My name is Claire Ashford. I grew up in a small city called Denton Falls, the kind of place that had once been a manufacturing hub and was now mostly a collection of decent people navigating the slow economics of a town that had peaked in a different era. My father left when I was 11, and my sister Margot was 8. He didn't vanish dramatically. He moved 40 minutes away, started a new household, and maintained the kind of distant, obligatory contact that is technically present and emotionally absent. He paid child support until we were both 18, and then considered his accounting closed. I have no particular bitterness about this. It shaped things without defining them. My mother, Renee, worked as a medical billing coordinator for a regional hospital network, a job that required precision, patience, and the ability to hold an enormous amount of detail in your head simultaneously. She was good at her job. She was less architecturally suited to managing the emotional ecosystem of 2 daughters with very different requirements. Margot required a great deal. I required, or at least requested, very little. The math of that imbalance sorted itself out the way these things always do. The child who asks for less gets less, and learns to treat that fact as a character trait rather than a deprivation. I want to be fair to my mother here, because she is not the villain of this story. She was a woman who worked full-time and raised 2 children largely alone, and did her best with the emotional vocabulary she had, which was not extensive. She loved both of us. She showed that love differently based on who seemed to need it most on any given week, and Margot always seemed to need it most. That was simply how the household organized itself. I left Denton Falls at 22 with a degree in accounting, which I had chosen with the deliberate practicality of someone who grew up understanding that money was serious and imprecision about it was dangerous. I took a position with a regional firm in Caraway, a mid-sized city about 3 hours from home, where I spent 4 years learning the work from the ground up. I was not flashy. I was accurate and I was reliable, and in the accounting profession those 2 qualities will carry you a long way if you are also willing to put in the hours, which I was. By the time I was 28, I had passed my CPA examination, been promoted to senior associate, and was earning a salary that had taken me some time to feel entitled to, because growing up the way I had grown up does not produce a natural relationship with having enough. I lived carefully. I drove a car that was 7 years old and ran well. I kept my apartment clean and my finances organized with the particular attention of someone who has seen what disorganization costs. I saved a meaningful percentage of every paycheck, and I did not spend money on things that didn't matter to me because the things that did matter to me, security, freedom, the ability to make choices without asking anyone's permission, required capital that I intended to protect. I was good at my job and I knew it, and I kept that knowledge quiet in the way that people who grew up being told they weren't the interesting one tend to do. Now, before I tell you about Margot and the money, I need to tell you about Aunt Vera. Vera was my mother's older sister, the elder of the 2 by 7 years, a woman who had spent her career as a paralegal for a small estate planning firm and who had retired at 65 with a tidy, organized life of someone who had spent 4 decades watching what happened when people didn't put their affairs in order. She was precise in the way that Gerald, in my grandfather's generation, was often precise, not warmly, but completely. She paid attention. She filed things. She remembered things. Vera had watched me grow up with the focused interest of someone who recognizes a particular type and has opinions about what happens to it. When I graduated college, she gave me a card with $200 in it and a note that read, in her small, exact handwriting, "A record of what you're owed is not the same as a demand. But it is the difference between knowing and guessing. Keep records." I had taped that note to the inside of my first desk drawer, and more, or less structured the next decade of my professional life around it. Vera lived in the same city as my mother, about 15 minutes from Renee's house. She had never married, had no children, and had therefore developed the particular attentiveness of a person who invests their observation in other people's lives rather than their own complications. She knew things. She remembered things. And she had, I would discover, been keeping her own quiet accounting for a long time. I had lunch with Vera every time. I came home to visit, which was 3 or 4 times a year. We would eat at the same diner near her apartment. She liked the booth by the window. She always ordered the same thing, and she always asked me the same opening question. "How are your numbers?" She did not mean my feelings. She meant my finances, my savings rate, my career trajectory. It was the most direct form of love I received from anyone in my family, and I valued it in proportion to its rarity. She had been asking gently for about 2 years whether I was certain the arrangement with Margot was structured the way I thought it was. Not accusatorially. Just asking. The way a good paralegal asks questions, because the answer matters, and because no one else is going to ask it for you. I had been telling her it was fine. The phone call from Margot that started the arrangement came in the spring of the year I turned 25. She had just left her second job in 18 months. The first had been a restaurant management position that she described, with genuine emotion, as a toxic environment where her contributions had been ignored and her manager had singled her out unfairly. The second was an administrative role at a dental practice that ended under circumstances that Margot explained differently every time she told a story. Sometimes she had quit, sometimes she had been let go, sometimes it was a mutual decision precipitated by a scheduling conflict that had spiraled. I had stopped trying to reconcile the versions. What was consistent was the need. She had rent due. She had a car payment. She had, she said, a plan to get stable, a contact who had mentioned a sales position, a certification she was going to pursue, a timeline that was specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be unfalsifiable. She said she needed 3 months of support while she got on her feet. She said she would pay me back. She said this was a loan. She was clear about that. She used the word deliberately. She said she didn't want charity. The amount we settled on was $1,800 a month. I ran the calculation the way I ran all financial calculations. Income relative to fixed expenses, sustainable without strain, meaningful to her without compromising me. At 25, earning what I was earning, $1,800 a month was not nothing. It was also not catastrophic. I could absorb it. I set up a recurring transfer. I told myself it was 3 months. 3 months passed. Margot called with an update. The sales position hadn't materialized, but something else was coming together. She just needed a little more time. She was grateful. She said she hated having to ask. She said she knew I was the responsible one, and she knew that was hard sometimes, but she was really trying. I extended the transfer. I told myself it was another 3 months. I want to trace for you how the logic held across 8 years, because I think if you've ever been in a version of this situation, you will recognize the architecture. It is not that each individual extension was unreasonable. It is that the extensions were never accompanied by any evidence of forward movement, and I had trained myself not to look too directly at that fact because looking directly at it would have required me to act on what I saw. In the second year, Margot moved to a nicer apartment. She explained this as a practical decision. Her old building had a pest problem, the new place was only slightly more expensive, and being in a better environment was important for her mental state while she was rebuilding. I didn't comment on this. In the third year, she took a vacation to a beach destination with a friend. She posted photographs. I saw them on a Sunday morning while I was making coffee, and I had a sensation in my chest that was less like anger and more like the feeling of a number not adding up, that specific cognitive dissonance of a spreadsheet that almost works. I told myself she deserved rest. I kept the transfer running. In the fourth year, she called me to report that she had finally found a job she believed in, a marketing coordinator position at a small lifestyle company. She was excited. Her voice had the particular brightness of someone who means it. I was genuinely glad for her. I told her we should talk about a repayment structure now that she had income. She said, "Of course, absolutely. Let's do that once I'm past the probationary period and I know what my cash flow looks like." The probationary period ended. We did not have that conversation. In the fifth year, I raised it again on the phone, carefully. I said that I had been running the numbers and the total transferred was now well over $100,000, and I thought it made sense to at least document the repayment plan formally, not because I was pressuring her, I said, but because it was important to have agreements in writing. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, in the tone of someone who is genuinely surprised you have raised an unpleasant topic, "Claire, I thought we understood each other. I'm doing my best. I'm not in a position to formalize anything right now. It would feel like you're putting legal pressure on me, and that would really damage our relationship. You know how much this support has meant to me." I said I understood. I did not press further. I sat at my kitchen table that evening for a long time. My apartment was very quiet. I had a glass of water I wasn't drinking and a view of the street outside my window and the particular stillness of a person who has just confirmed something they had been refusing to confirm for a long time. I called Vera the next morning, not to tell her everything, not yet, but because Vera was the person whose counsel I trusted when the numbers didn't add up, and the numbers, I was finally ready to admit, had not been adding up for a long time. Vera listened. She asked a few questions, dates, amounts, whether anything had been put in writing. When I told her nothing had been documented beyond the bank transfer records, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Come to lunch when you're next in town. And bring your transfer history." In the 6th and 7th years, I kept the transfers running while Vera and I had a series of quiet, methodical conversations about the situation and about my options. I want to be honest that the reason I kept the transfers running during this period was not financial naivety. I had spent 20 years being the person who held things together, and I was not yet ready to become the person who let something fall, even when what was falling had never been mine to carry. The 8th year was different. In the 8th year, Margot was promoted at the lifestyle company. She announced this on her social media with a celebratory post that included a photograph of herself at what appeared to be a company dinner, dressed well, smiling with colleagues, a glass of wine in her hand, and the easy posture of someone who is comfortable in a room. She looked, by every visible measure, stable. She looked like someone who had gotten on her feet some time ago and had simply not adjusted the accounting. I did not call to congratulate her immediately. I sat with the photograph for a day, and then I called Vera and said, "I think it's time. Here is what I want you to understand about how I documented 8 years of transfers. I had never stopped documenting them, because I am an accountant, and accountants document things the way other people breathe, not because they are suspicious, but because the alternative is disorder, and disorder is where losses hide. Every month for 8 years, I had recorded the transfer in a personal ledger I kept on my home computer. Date, amount, running total, and a brief note in the memo column. M rent, M utilities, M bridge month, M stabilization. I had the complete bank records as corroboration. I had, in a folder in my filing cabinet, printouts of the transfer confirmations for every single payment. The total, as of the month I finally stopped the transfer, was $172,800. I had never quite let myself see it as a number. I had always seen it as a series of monthly decisions, each one defensible in isolation. When I exported the full record and saw the sum in a single cell at the bottom of the spreadsheet, something in my throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. The surprise was that it had taken me this long to look. Vera had her own documentation. This is the part that matters. Over the years, Vera had developed the habit of attending family gatherings with the attention of a deposition witness. She had been present at dinners, at holiday events, at the occasional Sunday lunch where Margot and I were both in the same room, and Margot's characterization of her financial situation tended to shift depending on her audience. Vera had noted these shifts. She had, in her precise paralegal way, written brief memos to herself after each gathering, date, who was present, what was said, any material inconsistency with previous statements. She had also, over the past 2 years, compiled something more concrete. Through the estate planning firm where she had spent her career, she had a professional relationship with a man named Douglas Hale, a forensic accountant who did occasional consulting work on estate disputes and family financial matters. He was not dramatic. He was not theatrical. He was exactly the kind of person you want looking at numbers, methodical, disinterested in the personalities involved, interested only in what the documentation showed. Vera had, with my permission, shared my transfer records with Douglas 6 months before my mother's retirement party. He had produced a clean, single-page summary document, total transferred, monthly average, period covered, and a simple notation that no repayment, not a single dollar, had been recorded against the balance in 8 years. 1 page. 1 number. Her name on every line. I had driven to Vera's apartment and sat at her kitchen table and read Douglas's summary 3 times. My hands were very steady on the paper, the kind of steady that comes not from calm, but from having finally arrived somewhere you had been approaching for a long time. Vera poured coffee. She said, "What do you want to do with it?" I told her I didn't want to do anything with it under ordinary circumstances. What I wanted was for the record to exist, to be documented, witnessed, and available. Not as a weapon, as a fact. Because I had spent 8 years watching my sister describe our family's history in terms that erased my contributions entirely, and I was finished with that erasure. I did not close the transfer account before the party. I closed it the week after Margot's promotion post, 3 months before my mother's retirement celebration. I simply logged into my bank account, navigated to the recurring transfer, and canceled it. No announcement. No explanation. The money simply stopped arriving in Margot's account. She called 4 days later. Her tone was light, carefully light, the register of someone probing rather than confronting. She said she hadn't received the transfer yet and wanted to make sure everything was okay on my end. Banks could be funny sometimes. I said everything was fine on my end. She said, "Oh, did the transfer not go through?" I said, "I canceled it. I'm taking a break from that arrangement for a while." There was a silence. And then she said, with remarkable composure, "Okay, we can talk about that." I said there wasn't much to talk about right now. I said I'd see her at Mom's retirement party. Douglas would be there too. He was coming as Vera's guest, which my mother had welcomed without question because Vera was bringing a friend, and that was entirely normal. He would have the summary in a manila folder in Vera's bag. He was prepared, if the moment arose, to read it aloud in his professional capacity. I had not engineered the moment, but I had come prepared for the truth to find one. My mother's retirement party was held on a Saturday afternoon at the Elson Community Center, a beige brick building with a decent event hall that Renee had rented for the occasion because she had spent 30 years in a profession that required meticulous organization, and she intended to be celebrated in a room large enough to fit everyone who mattered to her. There were approximately 60 guests. Colleagues from the hospital billing department, some of whom had worked alongside my mother for over 2 decades. Neighbors. People from the church she attended on occasional Sundays. A few old friends from Denton Falls who had driven up for the day. My mother's book club, which she had been part of for 11 years and which she regarded with a loyalty that I found genuinely touching. It was, by every measure, a room full of people who knew Renee and cared about her, and who had assembled specifically to mark the end of a long chapter of her working life with appropriate warmth and recognition. I arrived with time to spare. I had driven the 5 hours from Caraway the evening before and stayed at a hotel rather than at my mother's house, partly for logistics and partly because I had found, over the past several years, that staying at my mother's house when Margot was also present had a particular quality of tension that was not conducive to the kind of sleep I needed. The hall was decorated with photographs from my mother's career, a small display on a folding table near the entrance, showing pictures of Renee at various stages of her working life, her department over the years, a few photos of us as children that I recognized from the house in Denton Falls. I paused at the table for a moment. In the childhood photographs, I was easy to spot, the one slightly to the side, slightly apart, watching something off camera with an expression of focused attention. Margot was always centered, always in motion, always mid-laugh. I went and found my seat. I was at a table near the middle of the room, with two of my mother's colleagues, a woman named Patty, who had been in billing for 15 years and had a warm, immediate laugh, and a younger man named Trevor, who had worked directly with my mother on the complex insurance cases and spoke about her with the specific admiration of someone who has learned from a genuinely good teacher. I liked them immediately. We talked about work, their work, the technical challenges of medical billing, the particular satisfaction of getting a complicated claim resolved correctly. It was the kind of conversation I was good at, and I settled into it with the ease of someone who has found the right frequency. Margot arrived 20 minutes after I did, with a friend I didn't recognize, a woman about her age, well-dressed, the kind of easy social confidence that suggests a person who has never found a room difficult to enter. Margot herself looked well. She looked, as she always looked at events like this, exactly like the version of herself she most wanted people to see. Bright, warm, a little breathless with the effort of having organized her arrival to seem effortless. She hugged my mother for a long time at the entrance. She made a sound like a small, happy exclamation. She worked the room the way she had always worked rooms, efficiently, joyfully, leaving people feeling that they had been the specific one she was most glad to see. She found me at my table, bent down to hug me, said I looked great, asked about the drive. Her manner was warm and entirely normal, which was its own kind of information. Vera arrived with Douglas Hale. Douglas was a compact, quiet man in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the expression of someone who has attended a great many events in a professional capacity and knows how to be present without drawing attention. He shook my mother's hand and said something gracious about the occasion. He found a seat at Vera's table, near the back of the room. The manila folder, flat and inconspicuous, went under the chair. The formal portion of the party proceeded with the warmth it deserved. My mother was presented with a framed department photo and a card signed by everyone who had ever worked with her. Her supervisor made a brief speech about her precision and her patience with new staff and her 23 years of showing up to do difficult work without complaint. Two of her colleagues told short, affectionate stories. My mother sat at the head of the room with color in her cheeks and the expression of a person who is genuinely surprised by being appreciated, even after decades of giving people reason to appreciate her. And then the program moved, as these programs do, into the open floor section, a few minutes for anyone who wanted to share a memory or a word. A neighbor went first, then one of the book club members, then a colleague who had retired 2 years earlier and had driven back specifically for the occasion. And then Margot stood up. I want to describe this carefully because I want to be fair, which is something I am still practicing when it comes to my sister. Margot stood up with the ease of someone who has no fear of public speaking, which she genuinely doesn't. That has never been her difficulty. She thanked everyone for coming. She said her mother was the most generous person she had ever known. She said growing up in a single-parent household had taught her what it meant to really carry something, to do the work that wasn't visible, to keep a family afloat through sheer force of will and sacrifice. And then she said, I've tried to carry that forward. To be the one who's there, who holds things together for the people I love. I think that's what Mom taught us. I've carried this family, and I'm proud of that. Claire tags along in her own way, but she's always known she could count on me. She smiled. She looked at me across the room when she said it. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of someone who genuinely believes what they are saying, which I have come to think is the most disorienting kind. 60 people were watching. Some of them nodded. My mother, at the head of the room, had an expression that was fond and a little uncertain. My hands were folded on the table in front of me. Something had gone very still in the center of my chest. Not anger, not hurt, but a kind of absolute clarity. The feeling of a calculation that has been running in the background for years finally completing. I looked at Vera. Vera looked at Douglas. Douglas reached under his chair. I did not stand up to make a speech. That is an important part of this. After Margot sat down and the light applause settled, a natural pause opened in the program, the kind that follows a significant statement and waits to see whether the room has reached its conclusion or whether there is more. Into that pause, quietly and without theater, Vera raised her hand, the specific hand raise of a woman who has spent her career in rooms where procedure matters, and said, "If there's another moment, I'd like to add something." My mother, who was running the loose proceedings from her seat at the head table, said, "Of course. Vera, please." Vera said, "I don't want to take much time. But since Margot brought up the topic of family support, I think it would be useful to have the full picture on the record." The room had not yet understood what was happening. The tone was still social, still warm, still the texture of a celebration. A few people shifted in their seats with the mild attention of guests at a gathering who sense that something slightly more interesting than the program has arrived. Vera nodded to Douglas. Douglas opened the folder. He did not stand, which I think was the right instinct. A standing man reading a document has a prosecutorial quality that would have changed the temperature of the room. A seated man reading a document is simply presenting information. He said, in the moderate, professional voice of someone who has read findings aloud many times and knows that the findings carry themselves, "I've prepared a summary of documented financial transfers from Claire Ashford to Margot Ashford over the period of 8 years. The total documented amount transferred, based on bank records, is $172,800. The transfers were monthly, at a consistent rate of $1,800. There is no record of any repayment against this balance." He set the paper down. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize the situation. He had read a number and its components and stopped speaking because the number was the entire argument and it required no assistance. The room processed this in the particular way that rooms process information that reconfigures what they thought they were celebrating. Patty, the billing colleague beside me, had placed both palms flat on the table and was looking at the center of it with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. Trevor had gone very still in his chair, his water glass halfway to his mouth and not moving. I could see, from where I was sitting, my mother at the head of the room. Her face had changed. The color that had been in her cheeks during the speeches had drained out of them in the time it had taken Douglas to read 2 sentences. She was looking at Margot. Margot had gone the specific pale of someone whose internal accounting has just been audited in public without warning. Her chin was up, the reflex of a person who defaults to presentation, but her hands, flat on the table in front of her, were not entirely steady. Her friend, the one who had come with her, had developed the expression of someone who deeply wishes they were at a different event. I did not look at Margot with satisfaction. I looked at her the way you look at an equation that has finally balanced, with the neutral recognition of a problem resolved. I was sitting with my hands folded on the table and my posture straight, and my face, I believe, composed into something that was attentive and calm and gave nothing away. My mother said, from the head of the table, in a voice that was quieter than the room, "Margot." Margot said after a moment, "There's context for all of that." Douglas said, with the patience of someone who has heard this before, "Of course. The summary only reflects what the bank records show." Vera said nothing. Vera had the stillness of someone who has done exactly what she intended to do and has no need to add to it. I said, "Thank you, Vera." "Thank you, Douglas." And then I picked up my fork and took a bite of the cake that had been placed in front of me at some point during the preceding 10 minutes, and I did not say anything else, because there was nothing else I needed to say.
The room did the rest.
The party did not end immediately. That surprised me slightly. I had expected the event to collapse under the weight of what had just happened, the way a structure fails once the load-bearing element is removed. But 60 people do not all know how to leave at once, and many of them had driven significant distances, and so what actually happened was a gradual, muted unwinding, conversations that became shorter, good nights that were warmer than the occasion warranted, the slightly accelerated quality of people finding reasons to be somewhere else. Patty, to her credit, stayed until the end and found me near the exit on her way out. She pressed my hand. She said, "I've been in billing a long time. Numbers don't lie." I thanked her. That was the whole exchange, and it was enough. Trevor stopped at my mother's table before he left and said something to her that I couldn't hear. My mother nodded once, very carefully, like someone who has received information that will take time to process. Margot did not approach me at the party. Her friend found the exit fairly quickly after Douglas closed his folder, and Margot followed, not rushing, but moving with the efficiency of someone who has decided that the room no longer serves her purposes. She said goodbye to my mother with a quick embrace and said she would call tomorrow, and then she was gone. Vera and Douglas gathered their things with the unhurried calm of people who have completed a task and are satisfied with the quality of the work. Douglas shook my hand. He said, "The document is yours if you need it for anything further." I told him I appreciated his time. He said it had been straightforward. My mother and I were alone in the cleared hall for a few minutes at the end, while the venue staff began the quiet work of stacking chairs. She looked tired, not the good tired of a person whose celebration has concluded, but the other kind. The tired of someone who has had to revise something important. She said, "I didn't know it was that much." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not sure I knew how much you were doing." I said, "That's all right." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Is it?" I considered the question honestly. I said, "It will be." She nodded. We hugged in the way of people who have reached the end of something difficult and cannot yet see the beginning of whatever comes next. I drove back to my hotel. The calls from Margot began 2 days later. The first was brief. She said she thought we should talk, that there was context Douglas's summary hadn't captured, that the situation had been more complicated than a simple number could convey. I said I agreed to talk, but that I had already spoken to a banking attorney about my options, and I wanted her to know that. There was a pause. She said she thought that was an overreaction. I said it wasn't a reaction at all. It was information. The second call came 3 days after the first. Her tone had shifted, less composed, more direct in a way that felt, for the first time, like the unmediated version of her. She said she knew it had been a long time. She said she was sorry the arrangement had gotten away from them. She used the phrase "gotten away from them," as though the 8 years had been a mutual project with a shared management problem, which I found interesting. She said she wanted to make things right.
I said I appreciated that.
I said I wasn't currently pursuing legal recovery. That was true, and it was my choice, made deliberately and not under pressure. I said what I needed was different. I said what I needed was for her to stop telling the story of our family in a way that required my erasure. That when she said she had carried our family, she was describing something that was, at minimum, incomplete. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I didn't think you minded. You never said anything." I said, "I know. I should have." That conversation was the closest we have come, in the time since the party, to something honest. It did not resolve everything. It would be accurate to say that our relationship was changed by the events of that afternoon, that it became smaller, more careful, more explicitly negotiated.
We speak.
We do not speak with the ease of people who are pretending the numbers don't exist. My mother had a longer conversation with Margot in the weeks after the party that I was not part of and do not know the details of. What I know is that my mother, for the first time in my adult memory, called me specifically to tell me that she saw what I had been doing. Not apologetically. My mother was not built for elaborate apologies, but in the direct language of a woman who has done financial accounting for 3 decades and understands what a number means when it sits unacknowledged on a ledger. She said, "You should have told me." I said, "I know." She said, "You were always the one who handled things." I said, "I'm aware." She made a sound that was as close to a laugh as the moment could accommodate. We talked for 20 minutes. It was one of the better conversations we had had in years. The financial consequences for Margot were not ones I engineered. The lifestyle company had a culture of performance-based compensation, and the quarter following the party was not her strongest. I know this only because it came up in one of our careful conversations, mentioned matter-of-factly as a context setter for why she was making some financial adjustments. I received this information and said I was sorry to hear it and meant that in the limited, genuine way it was possible to mean it. Vera and I still have lunch at the diner. She orders the same thing. She asks about my numbers. They are, for the first time in 8 years, entirely my own. Douglas's summary is in my filing cabinet, in the section I label closed, personal. I have not needed it for anything further. Here is what I know now that I did not let myself know for 8 years. Silence is not the same as consent. And patience is not the same as agreement. I stayed quiet because I had been the quiet one my whole life, and staying quiet had always felt like the sophisticated choice, the adult choice, the choice that kept the family from having to look at uncomfortable things. What I learned, finally, is that silence doesn't protect anyone. It just relocates the cost. Someone pays it. You've only decided who. I am not here to tell you that what I did in that event hall was righteous or brave. I'm not sure it was either of those things. I came to a party with documentation, and I sat very still while someone else read it aloud, and then I ate some cake. The brave part, if there was a brave part, happened earlier, the day I picked up the phone and said to Vera, "It's time." I have a theory, for what it's worth, about the particular kind of family dynamic I grew up in. The one that produces the quiet eldest and the expressive youngest, and a structure that everyone mistakes for a personality when it is actually a habit. The habit is this: the person who needs the least gets called the strongest, and the person who needs the most gets called the most beloved, and neither of those translations is accurate, and the error compounds across decades if no one reads the original text. I read the original text.
Late.
But I read it. And I want to tell you, the reading was worth the wait.
That's my story.
A spreadsheet I'd been keeping for 8 years, a manila folder Vera carried in her bag, and a number that didn't need any help from me once Douglas read it aloud. Here's what I want to ask you, and I mean this genuinely. If you are the one in your family who handles things, the one who sends money without a repayment schedule, who absorbs the shortfall, who stays quiet because staying quiet seems kinder than the alternative, have you ever stopped to calculate the total? Not as an accusation, just as information. Because I can tell you from experience that knowing the number is different from living inside it. Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know if this is as common as I think it is. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.